Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled Blender Lighting Sun Lamp Sky and Atmosphere. One of the special control settings available when using Blender's Sun Lamp object is the Sky and Atmosphere settings. To demonstrate the Sun Lamp Sky and Atmosphere settings, I've placed a simple mountain landscape model in my Blender scene. The landscape has a subsurface modifier applied to it, as well as a ground material made up of a number of textures. The lake is a plane with a simple blue colored material with a slight bit of mirror reflection. There is a point lamp in the scene at a very low energy level, simply to add a slight bit of definition to the landscape. I'll render the scene. As you can see, the landscape is dimly illuminated by the point lamp, and the world background sky is set to the default gray color. The first important consideration when using the Sun Lamp Sky and Atmosphere setting is the position and orientation of the camera. To display the full effect of the sky and the atmosphere settings, the camera must be focused above the horizon. That is, the sky background needs to be visible in the camera's image plane. I'll switch to the camera view in my 3D viewport. Note from this vantage point we can see the sky area above the horizon. Now normally the position of the sun lamp has no effect on the rendering of the scene, as the sun lamp has no fall-off effect. However, its orientation within the camera viewing plane is quite important when using the sky and atmosphere settings. I'll go to the top view and add a sun lamp object to the side of the landscape mesh. I'll then go to side view and place the camera in the center of my scene below the landscape, just so it's easy to see and edit. By default, the sun lamp is pointing straight down towards the negative Z direction. I'll render the scene. As expected, the sun lamp illuminates the whole scene from directly above. I will select slot 2 in the image editor and go back to my scene. Here, with the sun lamp selected, I'll click on the Object Data icon in the Properties editor, which displays the sun lamp's controls. I'll checkmark the Sky and Atmosphere checkboxes, and then render the scene. The difference here is slight. The background sky is brighter, and thus the reflections in the lake are more defined. I'll press my J key to toggle between the two last renderings. I'll select slot 1 and go back to my 3D viewport. To actually see the sun represented in the rendering, the sun lamp must be oriented towards the camera's plane. Here I will rotate the sun lamp minus 90 degrees around the x-axis, and then render the scene. At this angle, the sun lamp is essentially backlighting the landscape. We also get a yellowish morning sky and a hint of sun concentration. Here's the difference in the last two renderings. I'll select slot 2 and go back to my 3D viewport. I'll lower the sun lamp angle to minus 85 degrees so that there's a bit of an angle to the camera plane, allowing the sun lamp to illuminate part of the lake and the surrounding hills. I'll then re-render the scene. The sun lamp now illuminates part of the lake and the hills. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. I'll select slot number 1 and return to my 3D viewport. There's a wide range of control adjustments that are available under the sky and atmosphere settings. In many cases, it requires a bit of trial and error to find out the settings that suit your purpose. Fortunately, Blender has a number of presets to serve as a starting point for further editing. From the preset list, I'll select Mountain, and then I'll render the scene. We now see a bit more defined sun in the sky. There's also a larger sense of scattered light atmosphere in the rendering. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. The sky affected by default is blended with the world horizon color setting. The gray color we see at the edges of the sky are actually the gray color default settings in the world horizon color swatch. I'll select slot number 2 and return to my 3D viewport. I'll click on the World icon in the Properties Editor, which displays the World background settings. I'll checkmark Real Sky and set the horizon color to a light blue by raising the blue to about 0.8, the green to about 0.4, and the red to about 0.4. I'll then re-render the scene. Note now that the edges of the sky take on the blue horizon color set in the World Background Editor. Here's the difference in the last two renderings. I'll select slot number 1 and return to my 3D viewport. I'll go back to the Object Data Editor for the sun lamp. The blending of the world background colors and the sky settings are controlled by this Blend drop-down box and the accompanying factor control. By default, this is set to add the sky settings to the world background settings. We can replace the world background setting by changing the blending to Mix. Here I'll select Mix from the blending drop-down box and then re-render the scene. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. I'll select slot number 2 and return to my 3D viewport. The horizon brightness controls the brightness or the yellowness of the horizon color. The higher the number, the brighter or more yellow the horizon color. I'll set the horizon brightness to 0.5 and re-render the scene. The brightness below the sun on the horizon line is now increased and appears more yellow. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. I'll select slot number 1 and return to my 3D viewport. The horizon spread setting controls the spread of the brightness at the horizon. The higher the number, the more spread. The lower the number, the less spread. I'll set the horizon spread to 2 and render the scene. Now the brightness is a bit more spread along the horizon. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. I'll select slot 2 and return to my 3D viewport. The sun brightness control, as the name implies, controls the brightness of the sun. I'll increase the sun brightness setting to 3 and render the scene. The sun is much brighter, or really yellower. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. I'll select slot number 1 and return to my 3D viewport. The sun size control controls the size of the sunspot. The higher the number, the smaller the sunspot, and the lower the number, the larger the sunspot. I'll increase the sun size to its maximum, 10, and render the scene. The sunspot is much smaller. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. I'll select slot number 2 and return to my 3D viewport. The sun backlighting setting controls some of the scattering of the sun in the horizon atmosphere. The higher the setting, the more scattering. Now by default this is set in the mountain preset to -1. I'll raise this level to 0 and render the scene. There is a slight bit more sunlight scattering along the spread horizon. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. I'll select slot number 1 and return to my 3D viewport. The turbidity setting is a combined sun, sky, and atmosphere setting. Generally speaking, the lower the turbidity, the clearer the sky and the atmosphere. The higher the number, the more foggy and polluted the sky and atmosphere. I'll raise the turbidity setting to 3 and render the scene. The scene, especially the atmosphere, is now more foggy or dense. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. Before I go on to the atmosphere controls, note the position of the sunspot in the rendering. I'll select slot 2 and return to my 3D viewport. Rotating the sun around the z-axis will move the sun across the camera's image plane in the rendering. Here I will rotate the sun lamp around the z-axis 10 degrees, and then render the scene. Note the new position of the sun. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. To animate the sun crossing the sky, animate the Z rotation for the sun lamp. I'll select slot number 1 and return to my 3D viewport. Changing the sun lamp's x-axis will move the sun up and down in the camera's image plane rendering. Here I will change the x rotation to -88 degrees and render the scene. The sun is now lower in the sky. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. Now I could lower it more by adjusting the angle of the camera relative to the model horizon. I'll select slot number 2 and return to my 3D viewport. In the atmosphere panel, the sun intensity setting controls the amount of blue scattering in the atmosphere, resulting in a sun that is more intense with less scattering and less intense with more scattering. The default setting for the mountain preset is the maximum, 10, so the blue scattering in the atmosphere is quite high. I'll set this down to a level of 5 and render the scene. The atmosphere now is a bit clearer. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. I'll select slot number 1 and return to my 3D viewport. The in-scattering and extinction controls further limit the scattering of atmospheric light. Their default is at a level of 1, and I'll leave them at this setting. The distance setting is a multiplier factor control. Higher values here tend to increase the effect of the atmospheric scattering. I'll set the distance to 6 and render the scene. The atmosphere is much denser and more scattered. Here's the difference between the last two renderings. Now, much of this sun lamp, sky, and atmosphere effect is a result of playing with the settings until you find one that best suits your purpose. I'll go back to my 3D scene. I'll set the Z rotation for the sun lamp back to 0 and the X rotation back to -85 degrees. In the World Background Editor, I'll set the red horizon color to about 0.1 and the green and blue to 0, making a very dark red color. I'll also checkmark the mist checkbox and set the intensity to 0.3. In the sun lamp editor, I'll set the blending to add and the factor to 0.5. I'll raise the horizon brightness to 1 and the horizon spread to 4.2. I'll set the sun brightness to 2.2 and reduce the backlight to -1. In the atmosphere panel, I'll reduce the distance to 2.8. I'll then select the point lamp and increase its energy to 2.3. I'll then render the scene.